Imagine 100 gallons of water hit right here. To fix it, you have to temporarily hold up everything that's above that. And if you place one of those posts on the floor system, well, nothing is going to the ground here. The biggest threat to most people's real estate investment is structural damage. And the problem is, most people don't even realize their house has it until they find out thousands of dollars later. What you need to understand is you can't rely on your general contractor to find these things for you, and you certainly can't bring a structural engineer to every house that you want to purchase. Now we're going to go through the 3 questions I ask every time when I'm assessing structural damage. Number 1, is it bleeding? Meaning, is it getting worse on a regular basis? Is it structurally safe? That means, is it going to fall down? And 3, is it ugly? What are the symptoms that have been caused by this structural damage? I'm also going to answer, what does structural mean? What are the most common structural problems that you're going to find on houses? When should you run completely? And finally, how can you use this newfound X-ray vision to get the best deal you've ever gotten? Now, to help you understand all this, let me tell you about my buddy Brad, who went on a work trip and he came home and walked in his front door that wouldn't open. And then he finally got into the house and he noticed that all the doors were rubbing. And then he noticed drywall cracking throughout his house and the floors had actually separated. And then he was reminded that when he was gone, his wife wanted to drain the pool that they had on the back deck. And he walked her through the process of how you siphon the water down the hill behind his house. But he came to find out that she didn't really listen to any of that and she just pulled the plug. And that means hundreds of gallons of water hit the back of his house. And it basically destroyed the foundation behind his house. Now the drywall cracking and the floor separation and the doors that wouldn't open, those are what we call symptoms. And that helps us answer the question of, is it ugly? And here are some other symptoms that you should be looking for when you go to buy a house. Cracked brick or cracked foundations, flimsy walls. Literally, you can move them if you put some pressure on them. Sloped floors, the classic skate park roof, or you might call it a sagging roof. Visibly skewed walls, soft, bouncy floors, sloped ceilings or beams, bowing walls, rotting wood, cracks in the concrete floor or a tile floor, and any signs of unlevelness throughout the house that's not just caused by bad building. And don't forget the problems like my buddy Brad had. Cracked drywall, separating floors, rubbing doors, and cracks in the brick facade in the back of his house. Now, eventually, Brad got around to fixing the structural problems with his house, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the drywall got uncracked or the floors stopped rubbing. So it is absolutely possible to have the ugly without having the structural problem. But let's figure out what a structural problem actually means. To do that, you really need to understand what people are talking about when they're talking about structural. So let's look at the diagram of a house. Now let's pretend your house got cut right down the middle and you were able to see the profile. Here's what it would look like. You would have a footing, and on top of that would sit a foundation wall. And then on top of that, you would have your floor system. Here's the other side. And then on top of that floor system, you would have your exterior walls. And then you would have your roof. Now, to give you a different view of that, let's look at it from the broad side. So you'd have your floor system, the foundation wall. This could be blocks like this. Could be bricks. It could be a solid poured wall. And then underneath that, you'd have a footing. Then you'd have your wall. You're gonna have studs just like this. And then you'll have your roof line. Those are shingles. Now here's some things you need to understand here. The load all the way from the roof, through this wall, through your floor system, through the foundation wall, sits on this footing. And that footing needs to spread the load all the way from the top of your house through the dirt. So depending on where you live, you'll have different rules on how big that footing should be, how wide it should be, and how tall it should be, and also how deep into the ground. You see, some places have a lower frost line than others. So here in the southeast, we only have to go 12 inches into the ground, Whereas back in Colorado or Illinois, we had to go 3 or 4 feet underground to make sure that we were below where the ground can freeze. And also, depending on the region, you have different types of soil. Some soils are more like sand, whereas some are closer to rock. Therefore, you have different rules on the size of the footing. Now, just to make sure you have the names right, this is a footing, this is a foundation wall, this is your floor system, your walls, and then you're going to have ceiling joists, and you're going to have ceiling rafters. And also on the floor system, you're going to have a rim board on the outside. Looking at it from this view, that's the rim board. And from that rim board hangs your floor joists. Those span all the way across your living room or whatever room you're standing in. Now, one more thing that you need to understand here is that most walls, they're not all just blank walls like that. Most of them will have at least a window. And there's different rules for those windows because this wall right here is holding the load of the roof. And so you can't just take these studs out. Studs are what you call the wood from the floor to the ceiling. So there are certain rules about how you handle that. And what you do is you replace these studs with a beam. That beam is usually called a header if it's above a window or a door. And then you hold it up with some studs. And actually there's a stud that goes underneath it and then one that goes all the way up. They call that a king stud. And this one is called a jack stud. And depending on the span, you're going to need a different size of wood, and you'll also need more jack studs and possibly more king studs. Now, most houses are not 10 foot wide like this one. Most of them are quite a bit wider. So let's stretch this thing out a little bit. I am really bad at drawing and writing, but I try not to write on here. Now, remember what you learned with the window, that the wider it is, the bigger the wood needs to be, the taller that beam needs to be. Same thing with your floor joists and your ceiling joists. If you spread it out like this, you would have to have way bigger joists. But most people don't want to go through the trouble of sourcing that type of wood, and it'd be really expensive. And still, you'd have a little bit of bounce in the floor. So what people do instead is they build a pier and a beam right down the middle. This is a pier, and it's sitting right underneath a beam. And that sits all the way across your floor joist. And that, like anything, sits on a footing to spread the load across the dirt. Now this is what that would look like from a side angle. You would have your beam, then you would have piers that are sitting on footings, and you'd have multiple at different spans depending on the size of the beam that you had. And then on top of that, you could see the ends of all the floor joists. So this here is this right here. Now, we also extended the ceiling joists. So now we would want to build a wall in between to hold up those ceiling joists. And sometimes, depending on how these are built, there's two different ways to build a roof, either stick framed, meaning they actually frame all this in, or trusses, where a company builds trusses off site, they get them delivered to the house, and then they're stacked on top. A lot of times those carry a load differently, and there's different rules on how to handle that, and you never really mess with those. Whereas when it's stick framed, this structural framing will be carried all the way up to the rafters sometimes. So if you see that in your attic space, you know why it's there. And one other thing to understand, you see a foundation wall is built solid, whereas beam and piers in your crawl space or your basement, they don't have to be solid. They can just be these posts that shoot up underneath the beam. Why is that? Because foundations are also weather protectant. So you'll actually see some houses that used to have pier and beams, and then at some point they came and built a wall in between there because you need to protect the bottom of your house from the elements. Now, one other thing is most houses are not built without rooms. So let's look at an overview of your house. So it's not one big open room. It has a wall right down the center. And let's say that's this wall. And this, remember, is a load-bearing wall. And then let's say it has a couple of bedrooms right here and right here. So this wall, since it goes all the way up to the ceiling, is load-bearing. Whereas these walls here are only carrying the load of themselves. And that's where it's important to understand that there's really 3 types of structural members. One is a load that is carrying other structural members. like your footing is carrying the foundation wall on top of it, the floor system, then the wall, and then the ceiling and the roof. Whereas this wall right here has nothing above it. The only thing that it's carrying is the weight of itself and the drywall that's on it. And your floor system, the only thing that this is carrying is the subfloor that's on top of it and the floor coverings and all the people that are walking through. And that's why floor joists have to be pretty thick, and there's rules for the thickness. And finally, there's what I call accessory structural issues, like a deck, but we're not really talking about that. Now, most of the time when people are saying structural, they're talking about the first kind, the kind that's carrying the load of everything up to the roof. Now, before we move on to the third question that you should be asking yourself, I want to hit real quickly on removing a wall that's structural, because this is something that people run into a lot. Now, let's say that right here you have a kitchen, and here you have a living room. And people don't really like to have those closed off from each other anymore. So what they want to do is remove this wall. Well, as you already know, that's a load-bearing wall. And as you learned from the window example, you have to replace all of those studs with a beam. The important thing for you to understand here is that if you remove that, there are certain rules on the size of the beam that you should have, and certain rules for the size of the wood holding it up. And if you place one of those posts on the floor system, well, nothing is going to the ground here. You would also have to put in a new post and a new footing. And a lot of times, these are not things that you can find in a code book. Like you can find the different sizes of beams and headers you need for different door sizes and window sizes. For something like tearing out a wall, you usually need to hire a structural engineer, and they're going to tell you exactly what they expect. Now it's time to get back to my buddy Brad, whose wife dumped hundreds of gallons of water on the back of their house. Now, most of the time, that's not what happens to a house. That's more like a natural disaster, you might call it, which is not what we're talking about today. But instead of hundreds of gallons of water at one time, you get more like gallons hundreds of times from rain. So let's take a look at what that looks like on your house. You see, houses are designed to take on water, but a lot of them either were built wrong in the first place, or something happens that changes the way that they were built. Usually by something like a pest or bad building practices finally taking their toll. We call those open wounds, and those open wounds allow for bleeding. And the bleeding is basically water getting into your house where it shouldn't be, and ultimately causing structural issues. So when a house is built, rain is supposed to be able to hit the roof of your house, and then it will flow to a gutter. And the gutters will have a downspout that carries down the side of your house, and then ultimately it will be able to flow onto the ground, which will be sloped away from your house. Now here's the thing, your house is definitely meant to be able to take on some amounts of water, but anything that gets hit by water constantly is going to have problems. So let's go back to Brad's story. Imagine 100 gallons of water hit right here. Well, what happens is that ground gets saturated and the foundation, the footing underneath the foundation actually moves, and then everything above it moves because everything above it is loading down to the footing. And if enough rainwater is able to sit right here for a long amount of time, eventually the same thing will happen. Well, how does that happen? There's a few ways. One is that the gutter doesn't get far enough away from the house, or it doesn't work at all, and all the water is able to pool up right next to the house. But still, it can flow away. But a lot of houses don't have positive drainage, as you would call it. Instead, there's negative drainage. Or they're built on a hill. And then the water is able to come pool next to the house, and that's when problems start to happen. And moving up from there, sometimes water gets into the walls itself. And there's a few different ways that that happens. One is maybe a pest gets in and makes holes in the siding, and water is able to get in behind the siding. Or sometimes the gutters don't work properly. They need cleaned out and they're not maintained properly, so the water is able to overflow and then make its way onto the siding. And to make that problem even worse, some houses are built with no eave at all. This is an eave where the roof overlaps the siding. But some houses stop right here. And if the gutter's not working, then the water is able to flow right over the top and down the wall. And finally, windows are supposed to be what's called flashed in a certain way. And that's really the weather protection that you put around the window when you install it. And when that's done wrong, which it often is, water is able to get in around the window. And then one other thing to understand is that sometimes the ground comes all the way up to the siding. And when that happens, you absolutely know there's a problem. Because when water is flowing towards your house, it's not just water. It's water and it's carrying some ground. So over time, what's going to happen is the hill is going to start building the ground up closer to the siding. And eventually that groundwater gets into your siding and it really starts to rot the wood out. And so if you see ground that is all the way up to the siding, you need to understand this. Every house that's built somewhat correct is going to have the siding starting 6 inches above the grade, above the top of the ground. If you see the ground all the way up to the bottom of the siding, you know that there's some sort of problem. And finally, the roof. The main thing that's going to happen to a roof is that water is going to find its way into the attic space and damage the rafters, mostly through the protrusions on the roof. And that means where vents go up through the roof or your chimney. And sometimes in valleys that are made by a roof line, water can sit. And when water can sit, it's going to find its way in. And finally, skylights. If you have a skylight, it's probably leaking. So what do these symptoms look like? Well, in your attic space, if you stick your head up there, you'll probably see the rafters or the ceiling joists start to turn black because of the water hitting them. And ultimately, they'll rot out. And maybe you can see the insulation that's going to be in between the ceiling joists. Maybe you can see that some of it looks a little bit different than the rest of it because it's getting moist. And don't forget about smell. Just stick your head up there, and if you smell mold or mildew, it's probably because you have water getting up there. And then make sure you look around the windows for rot. And then visually scan the yard and look for any way that water can get towards the property and sit next to the foundation. There you know you're going to have problems. Now there are wood destroying pests as well, like termites. I'm sure you heard the stories about people getting their houses totally destroyed by these termites or other wood destroying insects. The thing about it is they're really easy to spot if you're looking for it at all. You'll see the tracks in the wood and other signs. And when you're buying these houses, you have to have your eyes peeled for it, but then you can just call one of the million pest control companies out there and they'll come do an assessment and tell you what it's going to take to get rid of them. And usually it's not that big of a deal. Now, it is a big deal if they've gotten in there and done a lot of damage, but at that point you'll know what to look for. And it's beyond just termites. There's other wood destroying pests. There's birds, there's squirrels, other rodents. What they usually do is they mess with your house in a way that allows for water to get in. Like they might eat open your soffits or they might eat holes in the roof. And that's what allows these bigger problems to start happening. There's also some more man-made ways for your house to have bleeding. One is showers, especially if you have rentals. You see, they're not really paying attention to these things like you might be in your own personal house. So you want to make sure that in the shower there are no gaps at all. Everything is sealed up nicely. There's no missing grout. Between a tub and the wall is caulked nicely so there's no way for water to get in. And also if you have a window in the shower, you're probably going to have issues because water will build up on the sill and ultimately get inside the walls. And it's this water hitting the inside of the walls constantly over time that ends up rotting out the wood. And remember, a structural problem means that any of these structural members are corrupted. Because remember, it's holding up things above it. So that means that to fix it, you have to temporarily hold up everything that's above that. And that's where the real costs come in. It's not by having to replace the floor that has nothing but the subfloor above it. It's by having to replace this footing that has all of this weight on top of it. And one more possibility is broken utilities. You got a water line that's broken underneath your house and it's causing the slow drip of water that ultimately saturates the ground under something like a pier and beam in the middle of your crawl space. And sometimes those water lines can be subterranean. We've actually had that issue before where the water was leaking and we couldn't even see it. It was actually our super high water bill that alerted us. So remember the 3 questions. Is it bleeding? Is it structurally safe? And is it ugly? Here are the 5 most common structural issues we deal with when we're buying these houses. Number 1 is a sloping roof. That's when the rafters are bent, and you'll usually be able to see what we call the skate park roof. It's a bunch of half pipes. And sometimes it's just the plywood decking that is in between the rafters, but sometimes the rafters themselves are destroyed. And that's a much bigger job because then you have to tear off the whole roof, the decking, and replace the framework. Whereas if it's just the decking itself, it's more like a standard roof job. Sloping floors, and there's 2 types of sloping floors. There's center depressed and there's center hump. And when it's center depressed, that usually tells you you probably have a leaking water line or water is getting into the crawl space, and it allowed this ground to get saturated and ultimately this footing to sink. Whereas when you have a center hump, that usually means that the sides of the house have sunk down. And that's a much bigger problem because when you go to try to lift these back into place, you're gonna crack the drywall throughout the rest of the house. Basically at that point, you'd have to lift up the whole house to be able to replace the foundation and the footing underneath it, which we've actually had to do before, where we cribbed an entire house and took out the foundation underneath it and replaced it with the house hanging in space. It wasn't cheap. Window rot and bathroom wall rot. A lot of times windows leak and bathtubs leak. So it's pretty common to have to tear out a wall in the middle of the structure. And remember, you have to hold up everything above it when you go and do that. Ground erosion and wall rot. That's the situation where the ground has actually built up to the siding and it wicks the water all the way through the wall, and you have to do the same fix where you hold up everything above it and replace the wall. But this time you have to replace some of the floor system as well. And finally, footing or foundation corruption, where water is able to sit on the foundation or the footing continuously. Eventually you have issues. All these issues differ in the degree, depending on how long it's been happening. Now finally, there are times where I will run from buying a house completely, even if I got a great deal on the front end. And the first reason is because of a big hill. See, when you have a house on a hill, not only is the water coming on top of the hill, but there's also water inside of the hill. You see, these hills work like big sponges, and all the rain all the way up the hill gets into the hill. And I actually found this out the hard way. When I spent thousands and thousands of dollars to stop the house from getting water, we put in retaining walls, French drains, we did everything that you can think of. But water was still coming into the basement. And finally, I was digging a hole in the backyard, and 3 feet deep, I realized there was actually running water. It was like a stream underneath the ground. And so at that point, you really have 2 choices. One is you either waterproof the heck out of the house, and basically you turn the house into one big rock that's sitting in the middle of that stream. And you know what happens when there's a rock in the middle of a stream. The water always wins. Or the second way is that you just let the water in and then you find a way to get it out. And that's why you see a lot of basements have sump pumps. The water comes in and then it spits it back out the other side of the house. The next reason I won't buy a house is when it's in a flood zone or its own personal flood zone. You see, I bought houses before that are the low spot in the neighborhood, and all the water from the neighborhood comes to that house and it has no way to get out. This is usually coupled with storm water drainage in the neighborhood that's not working so well. And generally, if a house is in a flood zone at all, I won't buy it. Now, I know there's some regions where all the houses are in a flood zone, but they're built in a specific way to be able to take water from the flood zone, like houses in Florida and Louisiana, for example. But I'm talking about a house that is built like a normal house, but it's in a flood zone. That's when it's bad, and I'll never buy those houses. Next is a house built with no footing. Yes, I've actually bought a house that didn't have a footing. Found out the hard way. And the thing about that is nobody really looks for that because it's so uncommon. In this particular case, obviously no permits were pulled when this house was built, and it wasn't built that long ago, so all the damage that will be done to that house wasn't showing yet. Maybe that's a one-off. And the final reason is a pro DIYer. This is buying a house from somebody who knew what they were doing. Now, I'm not talking about the guy who wants to do a little bit of carpentry in his house or maybe hang some cabinets. I'm talking about the guy that thinks he's an electrician or a plumber or a framer. If I see any signs from a pro DIYer, I'm running. Now, I'm not expecting you to be able to know what a structural engineer knows, but you do have to take ownership of the houses that you buy as an investor, and you need to know the things to look for, because sometimes those things can help you either run from a deal or get a great deal. And actually, we did a whole video on how to use these things to find the best deal you've ever gotten using FBI hostage negotiation tactics. Check it out.